So I've got a local gateway running. So the gateway is actually running on localhost 8787. And on this gateway, I've actually not done anything else. I'm actually going to start setting up the guardrail to show you how things can work, right? So the most simple example is I just created a simple Portkey client. So Portkey mimics the OpenAI client. The functionality is all the same. So it's actually a drop-in replacement.
Okay.
And the way it works is I just specify a config for the gateway. So I can say provider OpenAI, give it an API key, put in the model, and then I make a call with this client.
Okay.
So just
and
make this request.
The config API key like overwrites the client like API key there, right? Is like the API key and like you said like client equals portkey base URL API key. No, the one above.
Yeah.
Is that
Sorry. Yeah, this API key is just Portkey's API key because I'm using it locally. I don't need to send it out. But this is the API key becomes useful when I'm using Portkey's cloud instance, and then I'm using. So this is Portkey's API key.
I see. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, so I don't need to use it when I'm just using it locally. Yeah. But this API key is actual OpenAI's API key.
That makes sense. Yes.
Right. So now what I'm doing is I'm sending all of this information to the gateway, and the gateway just makes the request and tells me that in the highest building in SF is Salesforce Tower. It gives me some information. Cool. The next thing generally people do is you would set up some sort of a fallback. I specifically chose Anthropic because Anthropic's been going through a rough couple of days. I think 13 plus hours of downtime. I'm not sure what's happening, but it's been bad, right? Because we saw 20% of all of Portkey's requests, and we do over 10 million per day. They were pointing to Anthropic, and
wow,
a bunch of them were failing. So I think very quickly people were setting up this fallback. And again, using the same gateway, I've just said, I'm going to use a fallback strategy. And the primary provider can be Anthropic, and I want to use Claude's model. And the secondary provider can be OpenAI. I'm just going to use Omni. I'm going to make the same request, and you'll actually see that this did go to Sonnet.
Okay.
But whenever Sonnet is down, the gateway can automatically just switch over to OpenAI itself. So just wanted to show you how the gateway works before we get into sort of the nitty-gritty of these things. But essentially, it's exactly the same code. I'm just changing the gateway configuration, and that alone makes the gateway aware of how it's supposed to make these requests and what to do in case something goes wrong. Yeah. So let's say, for example, I'm passing the same question, which is what's the highest building in SF? But then maybe along with this, I also have some context that I get from the user that is being added into the prompt. So for example, it's just picking user info Rohit at portkey.ai. And this is coming automatically because I'm fetching it from some system that has my email address in it. And then this is the prompt I give in. But I don't necessarily want to send any email addresses from my system to the LLM. So let's look at how I could just prepare a guardrail to stop this from happening. So this is a simple guardrail configuration I've written. So I've said this is a guardrail, and it has one check in it, which is a regex match. It just makes sure that no email format should be present in the input. So I've created this check, and I've said, if this guardrail fails, then deny the request. Right? So create a guardrail, add a check, and say what to do with it. So I've just said deny. And I'll add it to my configuration in the before request part. So if I go back to this diagram, so you have two types of guardrails. You have before request and after request. So I just go in here and I say before request, add this guardrail. Right? Nothing else changes in my request. I'm just passing this configuration back in, and I try to make this request. And it immediately fails. So it didn't even take time. So it did not hit the LLM, and it just says the guardrail checks defined in the config failed. You can find more information in hook results. And it's telling me this is the exact hook that failed. So it's telling me that regex match failed, and I can do whatever I want about it. And this gets thrown as a 446 exception because I said deny true. If I were to just make it deny false, for example, Yeah, it's still failing. I think it's gotten cached somewhere. But essentially, the request will be allowed to go through, but it will just record it saying that, hey, this had to fail. So for example, yeah, this one, it did go through.
Yep.
So, it said, yes, it did go through, but then it's still saying that hook results, you had it before request hook, which actually failed.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you have all of this good stuff and you're like, okay, fine. So you have your before request hooks working.
Mm-hmm.
Now, similarly, let's try something a little more complex, right? For example, I want to create a blog object with, say, title and maybe intro as a JSON object. And we're trying to do some JSON schema matching. So now on the output side, I will say, let's create a guardrail check. We have a JSON schema check available by default. And I can add the schema of what I want the JSON to be. So, this is just a schema I've picked. It says, have a title, have an intro, and go for it. And I create my simple guardrail configuration as we did above. So it's a guardrail, it's a JSON check, and it just has this one JSON check in it. I add it to my after request hooks. So this guardrail is now active, and that's it. So this is the part that keeps changing. The other part, I'm keeping it same in code, right?
The guardrails, okay.
Cool. So now, yeah, it's just the guardrail that I keep changing. So we try to keep it very modular. If you want to just replace a guardrail with another one, usually people would have this in a different file altogether, and you can pick which guardrails do you want to attach to the request that's being sent.
Okay.
Yeah. Cool. So this is just a prompt that says, create a blog on the rise of AI agents, respond with a JSON object with keys title and short intro. Now, we wanted the schema to say intro, but just to showcase, how guardrails work, I'm just going to say short intro and start with these triple ticks. Right? And then let's run this request. So what this is doing, this is actually making a call to OpenAI. On the output, it will check the schema that we mentioned and then decide, did the schema match the output or not? And I've printed the full output. So it says, this is the JSON, which gave it a title, and it did give a short intro. So, 4.0 is an intelligent model any which way. Sorry, this was a sonnet completion. So it gave in a short intro, but then we know that the hook results, the before request passed because there was no email in the prompt, but then the after request hook failed. So now this is in real time, I'm getting a feedback of, I'm doing something wrong, and the hooks are constantly telling me that this is going well or this is not going well. Right? And then there's a series of checks that we have by default, as I was showing you.
So the JSON
there's a bunch of
okay. I think you're just going to talk about this. The JSON tag that you do is like something that is written into the Portkey guardrails.
Yes, correct. So we have a bunch of default guardrails available. So, regex, sentence count, JSON schema, keys, contains, webhooks, moderate content. So there's a bunch of checks that we have available by default. Then we have all of the checks of Aporia, all of the checks of Pillar, and all of the checks of Patronus are also available to be used within Portkey. So you get this nice little library of guardrails that are default defined. And you can create your own guardrails, or you can even use the webhook guardrail to basically make a request to your system and get a response that defines if the guardrail passes or fails. Right? So that's the entire setup of guardrails. And obviously, if you're doing it all in the open source world, then this is how it is. So it's completely configurable. But you can also do this via the Portkey UI. So Portkey offers the UI to do a bunch of this stuff really easily. And let me show you how this works. So this is my Portkey dashboard. I've logged in, and I can go to guardrails, and let's create the same guardrail that we created there. It's just in a nicer UI format so that you don't have to remember all of the syntax, right? So I'm just going to say OSS, and we are defining the input check now. And in the input check, we had regex. So here are all of my checks. I'm just going to pick regex match. Let me pick the email check that we had done. I'm going to pick this and add this pattern. So I have my input check ready. I create it and this input guardrail is ready. I can also create an output guardrail now. So I'm just going to say OSS output. And the output guardrail, maybe let's be a little more, right? We just don't want simple stuff, but we say it should not contain any competitor. So, say for example, we're an e-commerce company, we don't want any competitor names to come in. So I'm just going to say no Amazon, no Best Buy, for example. So now these words, yeah.
Are these case sensitive?
These are not case sensitive.
Okay.
By default, yeah. We should probably add a check for that as well, but mostly people are just like the word should not be there. So these aren't case sensitive right now. Right. I can also do something interesting. So Patronus has a nice conciseness check. Oh. So I can just add a guardrail that says, is the model output clear and concise? I'm just going to save it. And I also want to check that the retrieval answer should be relevant to the question being asked. So for example, and I can keep adding more guardrails. There's a whole host of library available out here. But I'm just going to create this guardrail. And I have my two guardrails set up. So this is my input check. This is my output check. And I have the IDs for both of them. Mm-hmm. In Portkey, I can create a config. So I will just say create an OSS guardrail. I don't want the default config. Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to say, so virtual key is just a way to define that I'm going to use what provider and what API key to use so that I don't have to expose this in code anywhere. This is one of the core things that Portkey offers on our web UI. So you can, just manage your connections to different AI providers. So I'm just going to pick my OpenAI virtual key. And I'm going to say, again, in the same format, before request hooks. But this time I can just pass in the ID. So this was the input guardrail that we created. And then I add a after request hooks to say ID. And then I want the output ID. I'm good. So that's it. So I have my configuration created here. Save this. And I can just pick this configuration and add it to my code. So I'm going to come in here.
So since you're passing these through ID, does that also just mean that these different guardrails that you create are just available to all of the configs and I guess AI gateways within your project?
Exactly. Yes. So within my organization and within my workspace, all of the guardrails that somebody creates becomes available to the configurations I use here.
Oh, that's very nice.
This makes it a little bit easier because as teams expand, you want to keep sharing your guardrails that are working well for you. Yeah. So you just create it once and then everybody can just import it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Then I can have a slightly more neater code where I'm just going to say, okay, this time I'm using Portkey. I put in my Portkey API key. I just put in the ID to the latest guardrail we created. So, this is the configuration we created. So is this the config? Yeah, this is the config. Yeah, so I just pass in my config ID. And I'm going to ask the same question again. So what's the highest building in SF? And I'm again passing in my user info.
Mm-hmm. And you're telling it this time to ignore the model config that you've put in, but to just use GPT-4o automatically.
Exactly, yes. So just said, hey, just use GPT-4o. So it did give me a response. So it said, this is the response, but let's look at the hook results, right? So it did say before request hooks, the verdict was false because the regex did not match. And in the after request hooks also, it's given me, the verdicts for the different checks. But again, this isn't very pretty. So you can actually go to Portkey and view the logs for this request. So this is the request that's come in. So this was the input, this was the output. And I also have a list of all of the guardrails and how they function. So I can actually look at, regex match failed in this case. but in the output contains and the retrieval answer relevance passed, but the model didn't consider that this was very concise.
Okay.
So now I have a very good understanding of what's really happening with my request. When I come back here and I fix something, it'll automatically change.
Okay, so like the contains in this example is like something where you would opt out of showing the answer, but the other ones are like if it fails, it's fine to show the answer.
Yeah, so right now I think both of them were just fine to show the answer if it fails.
Okay.
Like for example, yeah, in this case, contains or regex match is where I would say, hey, just stop it.
Yeah.
So let's see how, maybe just to show you how easy it is to set it up. Say for regex match, I don't want this to proceed. So I come back here in actions. I'm seeing that there's already an on success, on failure action attached to it.
Okay.
But I can just say deny this request if the guardrail fails.
That's where that
and
is.
I'm gonna, correct. So I update it. So it says, okay, I'm gonna deny the request now. Go back here. I'm gonna make the same request. Let's see if it fails. Yep. So it failed and it said regex match failed. So it didn't even hit the LLM. And I can again go back to my logs and see that, this was a failed request. And we know that the guardrail checks defined failed, and this was the guardrail that failed. So you can very quickly then go and filter out all of the guardrail checks that failed, because they all have this unique status code, right? So you have this 446 status code and 246 status codes. That's giving you a sense of all of the failed guardrails, and then you can take some action on it.